Why it sucked to be a medieval monk. Daily life immersion. Imagine waking in the cold dark. Long before sunrise, your bed is nothing more than a wooden plank or a straw-filled sack. And the air in your cell, barely the size of a cupboard, is thick with the scent of damp stone and old linen. The bell rings. Matins, the first of 7. Sometimes 8 daily prayer services. It is likely the hour of 2 or 3 in the morning. You rise without a word. Silence is sacred here. You wrap yourself in your coarse will habit, the sleeves heavy, the fabric rough against your skin. You shuffle quietly through the cloister, the only sound being your own footsteps and the low echo of others on stone. The church is cold, always cold. Even in summer, the mornings are thick with chill. You take your place in the stalls. Candlelight flickers in alcoves, and for the next hour or 2, or more, you chant. Not in your native tongue, of course, but in Latin, the language of the scriptures. Learned slowly and sometimes poorly in early novitiate years. The chanting is steady, repetitive, the psalms. Ancient songs of joy and lament. Over time, they begin to blend together, sort of waking dream. And then it's time for lauds. More chanting, more kneeling, more silence. There is no coffee, no breakfast as you know it. Sometimes a bit of weak ale or watered wine, maybe a crust of bread, if permitted. Eventually, after the 3rd or 4th prayer service of the day, the labor begins. Depending on your monastery, you might be assigned to work the garden, growing herbs and vegetables with nothing but hand tools and prayer. Or you might be tasked with copying manuscripts, hours bent over a desk, eyes straining, the ink slowly drying on your fingers. You are not allowed to complain. You are not allowed to speak. Even gestures are frowned upon in stricter orders. Your life is meant to be a mirror of discipline, humility, and obedience. You eat in silence. You listen to someone else reading scripture aloud as you chew slowly on boiled grains, bland legumes, or on special days, a bit of dried fish. Sometimes the food is spoiled. There are no spices. There is no dessert. Afterward, more prayers, midday. Then none, then vespers, then compline. A cycle of sacred hours that shape your every breath. At the end of the day, again, in silence, you return to your cell. Your back aches. Your fingers are stiff. Your stomach still grumbles, and the cold has not lifted. The candle burns low. Tomorrow will be the same, and the next, and the next. Imagine a life without laughter, without warmth, without touch. Life ruled by bells, by scripture, by obedience. To serve God, they said, was to deny the self, to bury comfort, to bury desire. Some found peace in it. Others quietly broke. But regardless, the bell will ring. And you must rise. The rise and fall of Thomas Becket. Now, let us drift away from the silent cells of the monastery and into the grand halls of power. Not all churchmen wore threadbare robes or whispered chants in the cold. Some moved through the corridors of kings and stood at the center of storms. One such man was Thomas Becket. Imagine a boy born not into nobility, but into a merchant's family in London. The year is 1119, or perhaps 1120. Records blur. Names shift like leaves on the wind. Young Thomas is clever, sharp, observant. He is educated modestly at first, and then more deeply in Paris, in Italy, and within the legal and theological traditions of the church. Through connections, charm, and quiet ambition, he becomes a trusted aide to none other than King Henry II of England. And soon, Becket becomes chancellor, one of the most powerful roles in the realm. He and Henry are close. They hunt together, laugh together, plot together. But then, the crown wants more. Henry decides to appoint his dear friend as Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest cleric in England, thinking that Thomas will serve both God and King. But Thomas changes. Courtly robes are replaced with monastic habits. The laughter fades. The man who once dined with nobles now fasts with monks. He becomes fiercely protective of the church's independence, and begins to oppose. The king, what follows is a slow, growing rupture. Disputes over legal rights, over control, over loyalty. Years pass. Thomas goes into exile in France. Letters fly between courts. Tensions simmer. Eventually, there is a reconciliation. Of sorts, Thomas returns to England, but all is not calm. One cold day in 1170 in the great cathedral of Canterbury, Thomas Becket is murdered by knights, Acton they claim, on the frustrated words of Henry himself. The archbishop falls before the altar, blood in the place of blessing, but no shouts. No screams, only silence. And then centuries of awe, debate. In pilgrimage, he becomes a martyr, a symbol, a saint. And in the stillness of that great stone church, the echo of power and conscience still lingers. The secret tunnels beneath Glastonbury Abbey. Mystery, archaeology, culture, deep dive. Let us leave the courts and cathedrals now and return to the earth. Beneath the lush green hills of Somerset lie the crumbled remains of Glastonbury Abbey. Today, it's a ruin, peaceful, open to the sky. But centuries ago, it was one of the most revered religious sites in all of England. And beneath its stones lie secrets. Stories passed down in hushed tones. Stories of tunnels, hidden chambers, and lost knowledge. It is said that Joseph of Arimathea, the man who gave his tomb for Christ, once walked here, that he brought with him the Holy Grail, that he planted a thorn tree which bloomed at Christmas. It is said that beneath the abbey's foundations were crypts, vast, vaulted, and untouched by time. And in 1191, the monks of Glastonbury made a curious announcement. They claimed to have discovered the tomb of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. A great cross, they said, marked the site, buried deep beneath the church in a hollowed oak. Skeptics have debated it ever since. Was it a genuine discovery? Or a clever tale to raise funds after a devastating fire? Archaeologists have unearthed some of the tunnels, narrow passageways, worn steps, traces of chambers once lined with bones and relics. What lay there? We cannot be sure. Some say the tunnels were part of a secret escape route. Others, a place for sacred rites. All we know is that they were built with care, deliberate, hidden, and now only silence remains. No grail has been found, no clear record of Arthur. It's just earth, stone, and mystery. In the soft wind that blows across the abbey ruins, there is a kind of whisper. Of fact, but of belief. A belief that beneath the cold stones of the past, something sacred still sleeps. And now, let us rise from the tunnels and step into the warm light of stained glass windows. Imagine a bishop's palace in medieval France. High ceilings, polished wood, walls painted with saints and scripture, and a table, long gleaming, set for supper. This is not the cold cell of a monk. This is the world of the ecclesiastical elite. The bishop is a man of power, spiritual and political, appointed not only for his piety, but for his alliances. He moves through courts, commands lands, oversees wealth. His garments are rich, velvet trimmed in gold, rings glinting on each finger. He holds land, rents it to peasants, receives tithes from churches, answers letters. Sealed in wax meals here are not broth and barley. They are of roasted meats, imported spices, preserved fruits, goblets of wine, platters of cheese, servants at attention. He dines not in silence, but in conversation with clerks, nobles, ambassadors. He speaks Latin and French, and sometimes with careful precision the dialect of the local people. But with privilege comes politics. Every action watched, every letter weighed. He must navigate papal authority, royal pressure, and local unrest. A bishop may bless a marriage one day and command troops the next. He lives between heaven and earth, between scripture and strategy. And when he retires to his private chapel, candlelight flickering across golden altarpieces, he may wonder if he has truly served the divine, or merely worn its garments. Let us remain within the monastery's walls and listen. not to conversation, not to laughter, but to the sound that shaped every hour, the bell. You did not own a clock. You did not set your schedule. The bell decided. It tolled before dawn, pulling you from shallow sleep. It rang again at prime, then terce, then sext, then none, then vespers, then compline. Each bell meant something. A prayer, a meal, a pause, a return to labor. Its tone was not alarming. It was low, echoing, slow. But its power was absolute. You could not ignore the bell, not for pain, not for weather, not even for exhaustion. Its rhythm was your rhythm. Even your thoughts, your hunger, your weariness, began to mold themselves to the bell's call. And in time, the bell no longer woke you. Your body, shaped by years of obedience, rose before it rang. You had become part of the schedule, a living hourglass, turning with each chime. There was comfort in that, a sense of place, a purpose, but also a quiet surrender. You no longer belonged to time. Time belonged to the bell. Now, follow the echo of soft footfalls into the scriptorium, a room set aside for the work of the hand and the devotion of the eye. Monks created illuminated manuscripts, texts adorned with gold, ink, and vivid color. It began with silence, then the soft sound of quill on vellum. You sat with your back straight, light streaming from a narrow window. A page before you stretched and prepared. One letter at a time, Latin words flowed from memory and model, copied with care. Margins left wide for illustration. A dragon curled through the border, a vine wrapped around an initial. A tiny monk, perhaps a playful self-portrait, peered from the bottom corner. But this was not play. It was worship. Every curl, every brush of pigment was an act of reverence. Mistakes were scraped away with sharpened bone. Ink blots were disasters. You prayed with your hands. And when you laid down your quill at dusk, your eyes stung, the page glowed. In time, your manuscript might be bound in leather, carried by pilgrims, or placed in a sacred library. You would be long gone, but your work, slow, careful, and silent, would endure. A prayer that could be read. Scriptorium was not a lively place. It was not meant to be. It smelled of ink and vellum and old wood. See, it was cooler than other rooms. The thick stone kept the sun away. Each monk sat at a desk, angled just right, with an inkwell, a knife, and a candle for dim days. You did not speak, not even in a whisper. Your eyes moved from model to page. Your hand remained steady. Your back ached. Your knees stiffened. Only movement was the steady rhythm of work. Some monks transcribed scripture. Others worked on chronicles, preserving the news of kings and kingdoms, stories that might otherwise be lost. Still others copied lives of saints, hoping the example would inspire. There were no distractions, no idle thoughts, only lines, curves, punctuation, patience. You could spend years on a single book. And when it was done, when the ink dried and the pages were sewn together, you did not sign your name. It was never about pride, only about preserving the sacred. One letter at a time. Outside the walls of stone, there was another world, one of roots, leaves, and sunlight. The monastic garden, not a garden for beauty, but for necessity. You grew what you needed: leeks, onions, turnips, lentils, and herbs, not for taste, but for healing. Thyme for cough, mint for sleep, yarrow for wounds. The garden was orderly, divided into beds, each plant known, remembered, used. You knelt in the dirt, your robe brushing soil, your hands muddy, the scent of rosemary in the air. You worked in silence. The only sounds were bees, birds, and the wind shifting through. Rows of sage. There was wisdom in the garden. It's a kind passed down from monk to monk, written in quiet treatises, tested with care. When a brother fell ill, you brought him mulled wine with marjoram, or a compress soaked in chamomile tea. The knowledge was practical and sacred. The garden reminded you of life, of cycles, of death, of renewal. Sometimes when prayers felt distant, the smell of lavender in your hands felt like faith. The monastery was not entirely closed beyond its gates. Weary travelers came, pilgrims, merchants, sometimes noblemen, even wandering monks. They were not turned away. Hospitality was holy. A guest house stood apart from the cloister. Modest, clean, simple. You might be assigned to prepare its sweeping floors, airing blankets, drawing water. Guests were given food, often the same as yours: broth, bread, small beer. Greeted with kindness, but not with questions. You did not ask their stories, but you watched, quietly. Some walked with staffs, some with wounds, some with guilt. You gave them a cot, a meal. In the morning they left, and you returned to silence. But for that one evening, you became part of their journey, and they part of yours. The cloister was the heart of the monastery. A square path, stone-arched and covered, circling a small, tended garden. You walked it slowly, not for exercise, but for thought, or simply your own memories. Each corner turned brought repetition, familiarity, stillness. You passed the chapel door, the library, the refectory, the same sights, day after day, and yet each walk felt different. The weather shifted. Light moved through stained glass. Your thoughts followed different paths. Sometimes you remembered your family, sometimes your sins. Sometimes you thought of nothing at all. The cloister was not meant to change you, only to hold you, to give your restless mind something quiet to circle, like prayer, like breath, like the turning of the seasons. Let us pause now and look around. Monasteries were not built in haste. They were shaped by vision and meaning, stone by stone, arch by arch. Each part spoke of heaven. The walls were thick, cool to the touch, built to last, not decades, but centuries. The windows were narrow. Light filtered in like memory, soft angled, sometimes colored by glass. The chapel rose higher than the other buildings. Its ceiling pointed upward, a reminder that you, too, should look toward the divine. There were carvings, angels and vines, lions and lambs, all rich with quiet symbolism. Even the floor plan followed a purpose: a cross, often, or a circle. Shape of a tree, branching with sacred intent. You were inside a prayer built from stone. Nothing was random, even stillness had structure, not all was silent. In the chapter house, monks gathered each morning, and they spoke. You sat on cold stone benches, arranged in a circle, a symbolic gesture of equality. Here the rule of Saint Benedict was read aloud, a short passage each day. It reminded you of your duties, of humility, of order. If a monk had erred, he confessed, quietly with bowed head. Sometimes there were punishments, not harsh but deliberate. A missed meal, extra labor, a day of solitude, not out of anger, but discipline. Here 2 plans were made: work assignments, feast days, decisions. You could raise your hand, offer a word, then return to stillness. The chapter house was the monastery's conscience. And like a conscience, it spoke rarely, but clearly, far from the chapel. A different rhythm stirred, the sound of ladles in pots, knives on root vegetables, and steam rising in the monastic kitchen. The cook was a monk too. His work was sacred, though it stained his robe with broth and soot. The meals were simple. Always boiled grains, beans, onions, a bit of hard cheese, bread, thick and dark, and small ale safer than water. Meat was rare, forbidden on many days. Fish, yes, eggs occasionally, but always moderation. The fire crackled in a stone hearth. A cauldron simmered gently, and bread rose slowly in an oven carved from clay and brick. Everything was prepared in silence. or near it. Meals were eaten together, heads bowed, a reader reciting scripture as spoons moved quietly. You did not speak while eating. You chewed slowly, gratefully. The food filled you, not too much, just enough. The kitchen was no place for indulgence. It was where hunger met humility. Illness was part of monastic life. No one was spared, not even those cloaked in prayer. The infirmary stood apart, quieter than quiet. Its beds were simple, straw, sometimes wool, covered with clean linen. A window left cracked to let the air shift. A brother might suffer from chills, or pain in his joints, or a cough that would not end. The infirmarian himself, a monk, knew herbs, chamomile, feverfew, honey and warm wine. He washed hands in rosemary water. He offered rest and prayer. You might be called to sit with the ill, hold a bowl, wipe a brow. You did not speak. You were a presence. Sometimes they recovered, sometimes they faded, but always were tended with reverence, because even suffering belonged to God. In some monasteries, children came to learn. They were not monks. Not yet, but they were being shaped. Oblates they were called. Young boys, often no older than 7. Their parents had given them to the church in hope or duty or poverty. You might see them in the classroom, slate in hand, lips quietly forming Latin syllables. They were taught to read, to write, to chant. They cleaned the chapel, served in the refectory, shadowed the elders, and slowly, monastic life took root. Some stayed, some left. But for a time, they learned the rhythm of obedience, of silence, scripture. And sometimes, in the dark of night, one of them would lie awake, dreaming of the world beyond the gate. Winter came slowly, but completely. The chapel was colder than before. Your breath hung in the air like smoke. Wasp rimmed the windows. Water in buckets stiffened to ice. Wore extra layers coarse wool cloaks, patched and shared. But still, the chill crept through. The prayers continued. The work continued. But the pace slowed. Vegetables were preserved in brine. Bread was harder, soup thinner. Hands cracked from dryness, lips chapped from wind. You stayed close to the fire when you could, in the kitchen, or the library, or the shadowed warmth of the cloister's southern edge. There was beauty, too. Snow blanketing the roof tiles, candlelight reflecting in, still puddles, and a deep, encompassing silence, as though the world itself had joined you in contemplation, even in silence. There was music, Gregorian chant, unaccompanied, rising like incense. You stood in the choir stall, hood low, book open. You did not sing to perform. You sang to a line. The notes were simple, layered, melodic, eternal. They drifted through the stone chapel, curled into arches, melted into shadow. They were prayers. They were breath. They did not rush. Each syllable landed and lingered. You felt the vibration in your chest, in the floor beneath your feet. And when the final note faded, you remained still. For the silence that followed was music too. Not every day was. Calm. Some days. You felt empty. Your prayers dry, your purpose blurred. You did not speak of it, but you felt it. Doubt was part of the journey. You missed the world, or felt unworthy, or questioned the silence, and so turned to the rule. It did not offer comfort. Offered consistency. It told you to rise, to work, to pray, to keep going. You confessed your doubt to the prior, quietly, and were told to be patient. Faith was not always fire. Sometimes it was simply staying. When a novice arrived, it brought noise with him. Questions, eagerness, hesitation. He was guided by an elder, given simple tasks. Observed, he struggled with silence, with the cold, with the pace of time. But slowly, the sharpness wore away. He learned to rise early, to walk slowly, to hold his tongue. He memorized the chants, the prayers, the rhythm. And one day, he stopped resisting. He began to listen. To the wind in the cloister, the bell before dawn. The silence in his own breath and the monastery began to absorb him. The library held many books, but not all were shared freely. Some were kept under lock and key. Texts from the ancient world, writings from distant scholars, pages filled with questions or contradictions. Censorship was not cruel. It was protective. The abbot decided what was read. What was copied, what was best left untouched. You may have glimpsed such a book, its script unfamiliar, its ideas unsettling. You did not speak of it. You returned to your psalter, your copy of Augustine, and whispered no questions. Not all. Knowledge was welcome. Some was simply too loud. Let us return to the quiet of the monk's cell. A small room, perhaps 6 feet wide, 8 feet long, a narrow bed, a wooden desk, a candle, a cross. No decoration, no warmth, just function. The walls were bare, the air still. Here, you slept, you read, you reflected. It was not a prison. But it did confine you in time. The silence grew familiar. You could hear your own thoughts more clearly here, not because they were louder, but because nothing else was. When you lay down at night, the candle flickered beside you, and in the stillness there was no fear, only simplicity, only breath. The monastery did not always feel heavy. There were feast days, holy occasions, marked by joy, not silence. Meals were larger, songs were sung, candles burned longer. You might receive dried fruit, a bit of wine, a savory stew prepared with care. There were processions through the cloister, special chants, the ringing of larger bells. Sometimes visitors came, priests, villagers, pilgrims. You smiled more on these days? Oh, not too broadly. You remembered the saints, the martyrs, the miracles, and you allowed joy to enter softly. Like a breeze through an open window, even the night was not entirely yours. Before the sun rose, the bell rang. You rose from sleep slow, aching quiet. The corridor was cold, the chapel darker than dark. You stood with the others, cloaked and silent, and the night office began. Soft chants, whispered psalms, long pauses. The prayers were not dramatic. They did not stir the soul. They steadied it, and when the final verse faded, you returned to your cell. You would sleep again, briefly, but your heart would remain awake. Outside the monastery, different rhythm moved. The footsteps of pilgrims, dusty, weary, hopeful, making their way to holy sites. One of the most famous was Santiago de Compostela in distant Spain. You may have hosted a few such travelers. They carried walking sticks, scallop shells, worn cloaks. Some came in penance, some in gratitude, some with nothing but hope. You asked no questions. But in their dust, you saw the world you had left behind. And perhaps, for a moment, you wondered what it would feel like to walk without walls. The library was not vast. But to you, it felt like a world, scrolls, codices, manuscripts copied by hand over generations. Here, the wisdom of the ancients rested quietly beside the teachings of saints. You walked the aisles slowly, ran your finger along bindings, smelled the faint trace of dust and leather. Each book was a labor, a prayer, a preservation. You might read quietly at a lectern, your candle flickering as the hours passed unnoticed. This was a sacred space, not for speed, but for stillness, not for answers. Though cloistered, monks were not apart from nature. They lived by its rhythm, tilled its soil, read its skies. You watched the seasons change from the same stone windows. Spring brought muddy fields and new shoots, summer long days and aching. Back's autumn, harvest and cool wind, winter silence and sleep. Birdsong was a kind of liturgy. Rain, a kind of hymn. You learned to observe with care, not to master nature, but to move gently through it. You saw God in the curve of a leaf, in the persistence of ivy, in the weight of clouds, and in time. The natural world became your second scripture. Not all was sacred. There were whispers of wealth misused, of abbots living richly, of bishops courting kings. You saw gifts brought to the monastery, coin, goods, livestock. You heard of lands? Acquired peasants taxed. You read letters sealed with wax, heavy with influence, and you wondered where devotion ended. Politics began, but you said nothing. You tended your garden, you copied your texts, and hoped that faith could live even in shadow. Death was not feared, it was expected. You buried your brothers quietly, in simple shrouds, in shallow earth. There were no speeches, no mourning garments, only prayers. A wooden cross marked the grave, and the next morning, the bell rang as always. The work continued. In your cell you kept a skull, a reminder of impermanence. You touched it sometimes, not with dread, but with respect. To die in silence was still to die in the arms of the divine. Some monks saw more than the visible. They dreamed of light, of angels, of cities in the clouds. They fasted until visions came, or prayed without sleep. You may have heard such stories whispered in the cloister. A brother who heard music no one else could hear. Another who saw flames behind the altar. You listened. You believed or didn't, but part of you kept your eyes open longer at night, just in case. Some monks went further. They left the monastery entirely. They lived in caves, in forests, in silence deeper than any cloister. These were the hermit's anchorites, desert fathers, souls seeking God beyond structure. You may have heard of one nearby, living in a hut by a stream, eating only roots and wild herbs. He did not speak. He did not write. But when villagers passed, they bowed. He had no rule but his own, and some said he had found peace too deep to name. Among monks, abbot was not a king. He wore no crown. But within the monastery, the abbot ruled, appointed for his wisdom, for his steadiness, for his devotion. He was called Father, and he lived as an example, oversaw the schedule, the punishments, the prayers. He spoke little, but when he did, the cloister listened. You might see him walking alone in the cloister walk, hands clasped, head slightly bowed, or standing at the altar, his voice deep and measured. His burden was heavy, discipline, mercy, order. When a monk faltered, the abbot guided. When conflict stirred, the abbot calmed. And when he died, the monastery mourned with solemn silence, for their shepherd had gone ahead. Monks were not only readers, they were craftsmen. They tanned leather, built furniture, forged simple tools. The sound of hammer on nail echoed in the workshops. You might have shaped a wooden bench, or bound a book, carved a cross for the altar. Your hands grew strong, calloused, careful. There was no applause, no signature, only the knowledge that something useful had been made, a thing of quiet beauty, serving a quiet purpose. Work, here, was prayer with. Splinter's time in the monastery did not flow as it does in the world. It moved according to the liturgical calendar. Advent, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, fast days, feast days, vigils, octaves. Each season carried meaning, repentance, joy, mourning, reflection. You marked time not by weather, but by ritual. Purple for sorrow, white for glory, red for sacrifice. The year repeated itself like a chant, and each repetition deepened your steps. Time was not linear. It was circular, a slow turning toward eternity, though enclosed. The monastery was not isolated. It held land, employed laborers, offered aid. Villagers came to the gate seeking counsel, or food, or refuge. Children were baptized in its chapel. Weddings sometimes blessed. You might distribute bread on holy days, or read letters for an illiterate tenant. The world outside needed the monastery, and the monastery served quietly, not with sermons, but with shelter. You did not speak freely. yet friendships bloomed. Shared glances across the refectory, passing bread with steady hands. Walking side by side in the garden, you knew his habits, his gait, his silence, no words exchanged. But something deeper passed between you, built over years of shared labor, prayer, stillness. When he fell ill, you sat beside him. When he passed, you carried his body to the grave. Though you said nothing, you remembered monks were human, and sometimes the rule was broken, a loaf of bread stolen, a word spoken too sharply, a vow neglected. Discipline was firm, but measured silence imposed. Extra prayers, solitary meals, you did not protest. You accepted. There was shame, but also renewal. You knelt before the abbot, confessed, listened, and rose again. The monastery did not expect perfection, only return. There were no shutters. When rain fell, you heard it. When wind moaned through the tower, you felt it. Not outside. It was part of the monastery. Thunder rolled over the stones like a chant. Snow layered the cloister garden with hush. Fog turned windows to milk. Your sun painted pews in golden stripes. You did not resist the weather. You moved within it and let it teach you patience. Your robe was simple. Wool, brown, or black. Heavy in rain, rough in heat. A cord at the waist. A hood for the cold. You wore it every day, repaired it yourself, slept in it. It did not flatter. It did not change. And yet, over time, it became part of you. A second skin, a uniform of surrender. You owned little else. But the robe reminded you you were not your possessions or your practice. At night your thoughts stirred. The day's silence echoed in your mind. You dreamed of fields, of old voices, of cities you had never seen. Some dreams were holy, visions of light, of saints, others confused. Fragments of past lives, of longings not quite extinguished. You told no one? But when you woke, and the candle was still flickering, you felt closer, somehow, to something eternal. Not all was solemn. Laughter lived, though quietly. A raised eyebrow during chores. A knowing glance when the reader dozed mid-psalm. A roasted beet passed. Under the table, joy was not forbidden. It simply wore silence like a cloak. You learned to smile with your eyes. And on certain feast days, to laugh with your whole chest. Just for a moment, then bow. Return to stillness. Some prayers you didn't speak, you copied them. Line after line, ink flowing from quill to parchment. Each word familiar, sacred, repeated. You sat at your desk, spine straight, right. Angled across the page. Mistakes were rare. But when they came, they were scraped gently with a knife, corrected with humility. The repetition was the point. Each letter an offering. You weren't just recording, you were remembering, and in time, your fingers knew the shape of prayer. Even in darkness, in the cellar, another kind of work. Ale brewed not for pleasure, but for sustenance. Water was often unclean, but ale nourished. You soaked the grain, stirred the mash, boiled it with herbs, waited. The air smelled of yeast, earthy, bitter, familiar. Each monastery had its own recipe. It's passed down, adjusted, honed. You drank. Modestly. 1 or 2 cups with meals. Never to excess. Ale was food, and brewing, a craft. One more way to serve the body, quiet the thirst. You did not speak freely. The great silence began at dusk. It ended after breakfast. In between, you bowed instead of speaking. A subtle gesture, a glance, a nod. Some places had a sign language of sorts, gestures for bread, book, fire. Even outside those hours, you chose words carefully. You listened more than you spoke. You let the quiet stretch, shaped your thoughts, until silence was not absence, but language. In the deepest room of the library were the oldest books. Text written in fading ink, on crumbling pages. In Greek, in Arabic, in tongues barely remembered. You did not read them, but you knew they were there. Books on medicine, on stars, on lost empires. The monastery was a vault of memory. Much of the world had changed, but here the past remained, waiting quietly. Wrapped in parchment and dust, some monks left the cloister. They walked long roads, carried sealed letters, acted as messengers between abbots, bishops, kings. You may have known one. He returned with stories of cities, of courts, of foreign dialects, but he spoke little. He had seen much. But his vow remained. Even in movement, he carried stillness. He reminded you that the monastery was not just walls. Was it way of walking, high above the chapel, the bell tower, its floor dusty, its rafters swaying slightly in wind? You may have climbed the narrow stair, rung the bell at the hour, the rope thick in your hands, it's the vibration humming through the stones, the sound carried over miles, calling workers, summoning prayer, marking the day. You rang it not with flourish, but with care, a guardian of time, steward of rhythm, not all monks stayed forever. Some heard a call beyond the walls. They were released from their vows, or sent to new monasteries, or returned to the world. You helped him pack a few books, a small satchel, a blessing spoken with closed eyes. There was no ceremony, only silence. But when he stepped through the gate, you felt something shift, a space in the choir. A voice no longer joined in prayer. You prayed for him that night, and listened harder the next morning. The monastery was not silent to birds, or cats, or bees. You may have fed a stray dog near the kitchens, watched swallows nest in the arches, tended bees whose honey sweetened the refectory bread. You did not keep animals for companionship. Their presence reminded you God made all creatures, their quiet lives. Moved alongside yours, but not even walls kept out the plague. It came in silence, a cough, a fever, a death. You buried brothers quickly. In mass graves behind the chapel, the abbot died. So did the cook. The gardener, you prayed longer. 8. Less slept poorly, but you stayed. The monastery held fast a lantern in fog. When the world was breaking, you lit candles, kept chanting. Every life ends. So does every day, and so does every chant. Compline, the final prayer of the night. You bowed deeply. The candles burned lower. The chant rose. Unhurried, steady voices as one. It echoed against the walls, then softened, then stopped. The silence that followed was deep, not empty, not cold, just complete. Tucked near the infirmary grew the herb garden, quiet, fragrant, ordered. You might walk the rows, brushing fingertips along sage, thyme, fennel, at each plant chosen not for beauty, but for use. Yarrow for wounds, mint for digestion, lavender for sleep. The infirmarian tended it with care, pruning in silence, harvesting at dawn. You knelt beside him, placing leaves into a woven basket. And even as the bells rang beyond the walls, the soft rustle of herbs reminded you, healing begins small, and always. In quiet then came Lent, 40 days of less food, less speech, less comfort. You fasted, rose earlier, slept little. It was no indulgence, only simplicity. Bread and water, a thinner robe, bare feet in cold stone corridors, not out of punishment, but to remember that all things pass. That hunger can sharpen prayer in that silence. When fully embraced, can sing louder than any choir. Once a book went missing. A volume from the scriptorium, hand-copied over months, vanished. There was no theft, no scandal, only absence. A gap in the shelf, a blank space in the catalog. You searched gently, quietly. Perhaps it had been taken for study, or lost, too damp, or borrowed and forgotten. But in its absence, you noticed something. How silence clings to the unknown. How mystery does not shout. It waits, and in that waiting, wonder blooms. He had been here longer than the walls remembered, as the old monk, with slow hands, with a soft voice rarely used. When he stopped rising at dawn, no one spoke of it. You took turns sitting with him, reading softly, holding his cup, watching the rise and fall of his breath. He smiled often and said little. When he passed, he was buried beneath a tree in the cloister garden, his robe folded neatly. His hands at rest, no monument, just a smooth stone and moss. But still his silence remains, like a hush in the wind. Now centuries later, the monastery stands in ruins. Stone walls softened by ivy, roofs caved, birds nesting where bells once rang. But listen. Moves through broken archways. Rain falls on empty flagstones. Still, the shape remains. The rhythm, the silence, the memory. People walk through with maps and awe. They see only stone. But once there were prayers here. Once there was breath, and though the monks had gone, the stillness still sings. One morning, that chant did not come. The bell rang. The brothers gathered. But no voice rose. The cantor was ill. You stood in the choir, unsure. Then softly one monk began. Single voice, thin, trembling. Others joined slowly. The melody was off, the pace unsure. But the silence broke. And even in imperfection, the ritual endured. Sometimes, devotion meant beginning. Even when the rhythm had gone, you wore simple shoes, leather, thick-soled, hand-stitched, over years. The path from your cell to the chapel wore smooth beneath your step. The shoes held stories, each scuff a season, spend 1,000 prayers. When they finally cracked, you thanked them and began again. New shoes, same rhythm. The walk continued. Winter crept in slowly. And one morning, your ink froze. A small bowl left near the window, solid still. You cupped it in your hands, breathed warmth into it, waited, and wrote slower that day. Each letter, a small triumph over the cold. Each page, a lesson in patience. The visit of a nun from a nearby convent once a year. The nearby convent sent someone, a nun calm-robed, weather-worn. She came to deliver a letter, or share a chant, or bring herbal remedies. She spoke softly, eyes lowered, movements careful, showed her to. The chapel offered warm broth, then silence returned. You wondered how different their lives were, and how similar, both lives wrapped in quiet cloth, bound by prayer. Asterisk the writing of obituaries in the cloister when a brother died. Someone wrote his name in a small book of the dead. No flourish, no praise, just the name, the date. Perhaps a note, silent, faithful, died in prayer. This book grew slowly, line by line, and one day, your own name would rest there. Simple, silent, but held in ink. For as long as parchment endured, asterisk the rain that lasted a week began on a Tuesday rain. By Thursday, the garden was mud. The paths were slick. The bell rope dripped. By Sunday, it hadn't stopped. You moved slower, ate in damp robes, slept, with the scent of moss and wet wool. But still, you prayed. Still you walked to the chapel. The rain was not punishment, just another rhythm, a longer psalm. Asterisk the bell that squayed one winter. During vigils, the main bell cracked, a deep, strange sound, then silence. It had rung for decades. Now it would ring no more. 8. New bell was cast, weeks later. It sounded different, lighter, younger, but you never forgot the sound of the old one, the way it echoed, the way it closed your eyes before prayer. Some bells never truly stop ringing. The monk who loved Bez' brother Thomas was known for one thing: bees. He tended their hives beyond the garden wall, spoke little, moved gently. He said bees responded to silence. Their hum was his psalm. In summer, he shared honey at the table, thick amber, faintly floral. When he died, bees swarmed his grave, then left. You remembered him every time a bee landed near your page, still gentle. Full of work asterisk the lantern that guided you at an IGHT at night. The hallways were dark. You carried a lantern iron-framed, with thin glass sides. It flickered in drafts, cast shadows across stone. You learned where not to step, where doors creaked, which corners stayed cold. The lantern became more than light. It was a companion, a moving circle of warmth. In the monastery's long hush, the song the novice couldn't, Sayinga, was young, eager, and when his turn came to chant, he froze, voice cracking, eyes wide. Silence stretched. The abbot said nothing. Someone else began the verse. Steady, slow. And the novice joined on the next line. That night, in the cloister walk, you passed him, he bowed low, you bowed back, and the next week, he sang true. The ghost in the cloistr never saw it. But some said, ghost walked the north cloister at midnight, a tall figure, hooded, silent, never harmful, never near. Just passing through. No one spoke of it by name.
Oh.
But when a candle flickered without wind, or footsteps echoed without weight, you looked up and wondered if some part of the past still prayed alongside you. The scent of vellum and wax in the scriptorium.
House.
The air was thick, not unpleasant, just dense with scent. Vellum. Smooth, stiff, smelling faintly of salt and skin. Ink, sharp, metallic, earthy. Candle wax, honeyed, slow burning. Layered on every surface, it became a kind of perfume. Familiar, anchoring. You learned to breathe through parchment, to find comfort in the scent of Scripture. The visiting boy, who has too many coups, he arrived with his uncle, a carpenter. Doing repairs, small, curious, unafraid of silence, he wandered near the chapel. Asked about the bells, asked about your robes, asked why monks don't dance. You didn't answer, but you smiled. The abbot said nothing, but gave him a pair. He left the next day, and for a moment, cloister felt louder in his absence. And just a little brighter, the lost chant, a memory, UNWRITTN. There was once a chant known only to one brother. He composed it, sung it only during Compline, but he never wrote it down. When he died, the chant vanished. Some tried to recall the notes, the rhythm, the final line, but memory fades like breath on glass. Now, only silence holds its place in the service, and in that silence, you still listen for it. The old cat that lived under the LTR. No one fed her. She simply arrived. Gray, scratched, quiet. She slept beneath the altar, undisturbed, half forgotten. Some said she was a blessing, others ignored her. But every night, for the final chant, you saw her tail twitch beneath the incense stand, and when she finally didn't return, you left a bowl of broth beside the step, just in case. The broken door in the eastern HLL never quite shut. The eastern hall door, it creaked in wind, swung slightly when walked past. Its latch, stubborn, no one fixed it. It had been that way. For decades, and somehow, it became part of the rhythm, a sound you no longer noticed until one day someone repaired it, and the silence it left behind felt strange, almost to complete. The blade used for scraping parchment was small, dulled, worn. The parchment scraper used to erase mistakes. Or prepare rough vellum, you held it gently, dragging across the surface in slow arcs. Its whispering sound was delicate, almost like breath. In time, your hand knew its weight perfectly, and mistakes became less frightening because you had learned. How to start again, asterisk the monk who spoke in his SLE. Brother Ale never spoke during the day, but at night, murmured. Entire psalms in perfect Latin, sometimes soft, sometimes urgent. Once, you heard him laugh. No one teased him, but in the morning, he often looked tired, and sometimes, when you passed him in the cloister, His eyes looked distant, as though he remembered dreams you couldn't follow. The light. Through the rose window at unknowing that noon, chapel transformed. Light poured through the rose window, red, blue, gold. It landed on stone. On wood, on robes, colors danced slowly across the floor, like silent music. You sat still, watching. No bells. No chants, just color and time. And breath. A cathedral of sunlight. For a moment, more divine than any psalm. The day the kitchen fire went, OUT it shouldn't have happened. But the hearth fire, steady for years, went cold. A gust, perhaps. Or to little kindling. You stood shivering beside an empty pot. Meals delayed, hands red with cold. Ash disturbed. It took hours to restart. But when it finally sparked again, warmth returned like a hymn, and the broth that day tasted like joy. The chalk markings in the CELL in the storage cellar beside the root baskets. Faint chalk marks, dot lines, numbers. A symbol you didn't. Recognized, old, smudged, meaning unclear. They were not removed. They stayed. Like ghost handwriting. No one spoke of them. Perhaps no one remembered. But each time you passed, you glanced. Once more and wondered who made them and why. The sound of quill on parchment at DAW, before the bells, before the sun. Scratch, pause, scratch. A monk writing, just a quill. A page. A hand lit by a single candle. You lay still in your cell, listening, not words, just rhythm, the language of ink, spoken without voice. The world still slept, but in that quiet corner. Someone was preserving it. The child who left bread on the WAL some mornings. You noticed a loaf of bread, placed neatly on the outer wall, near the gate. Never stolen, never spoken of. No one knew the giver. One day through the gate slats you saw him, a child, barefoot. Watching, he left the loaf. Bowed once and ran. You. Left an apple and returned the next day. 2 loaves appeared. The crack in the altar, step a thin crack, split the stone beneath the main altar, not wide, not deep, but always there. It didn't grow. It didn't close. You stepped over it every day, knelt near it. A reminder that even sacred stone is not immune to time. Even holiness can fracture, and still endure the feast. Of the patron scient once a year, the silence broke. The feast day of your monastery's founding saint, candles lit every window, tables filled with lentil cakes, honeyed nuts, preserved apples, chant grew louder, robes cleaner, spirits lighter. That night you even laughed. Quietly, freely, the saint long gone was remembered not in relics, but in joy. The library ladder that never eschewed a most. Ladders creaked, but not the library ladder, tall, narrow, perfectly balanced. Climbed it often, never startled. It moved like a whisper, no scrape, no groan, as though it too honored the silence of books, and when it finally did creak, one winter morning, you paused at the sound and missed the silence. The night the owls wouldn't stop Sal, Leon Jate began after Compline. 1 owl, then 2, then 5 calling, echoing, answering one another from every tower, tree, and arch. You turned on your cot, listened, waited. Eventually, you smiled. Even nature had its vigils, and when you finally slept, you dreamed of flight. The first snow on the cloister, ROF, no one announced it. You woke early, crossed the walk, and looked up snow, thin, silent, resting on every beam and tile. The courtyard. Trees wore lace. Your breath clouded. Your boots didn't. Yet crunch just hushed the white, and for once, the cold felt warm. The time the abbot coughed during Messacy never faltered, never missed a word. But one day mid-sermon, he coughed once, then again. No one laughed. No one looked. But in the silence, something shifted. He smiled, wiped his brow, continued. You realized even certainty sometimes clears its throat. The grain that sprouted in the stoniest small green Shoot. Growing from the crack in the flagstone near the scriptorium door. Grain, no soil, just light, just rain, just will. You watched it daily, never picked it. Eventually it browned, bent, disappeared. But the crack remained, and you knew. It might return. The stolen egg from the KTS in it was missing. Just one egg, from a basket of 30, the kitchen brother noticed, said nothing. Later a novice returned it. Unbroken, apologetic. No punishment, just a quiet nod. The egg was placed. Back, no further words exchanged. But the next morning, extra bread was added to the novice's plate. Sometimes, forgiveness is served without speech. The song the wind made in the unavvened certain evenings. The wind entered the chapel. It slipped through high windows, between pillars, and danced among rafters. It made a sound, not quite a whistle, not quite a hum, a deep low note. You once imagined it was the breath of saints, or perhaps the stones. Exhaling their age, no one spoke of it, but everyone listened. The novice, who arrived in winter, he came with frost on his robe, red hands, hollow eyes. He didn't speak for weeks. He struggled with chants, forgot prayers, but he listened. He carried buckets, lit candles, sat through storms. Spring came, when one morning his voice joined the psalm, not loudly, but with peace. The thread. In the abbot's robe hung from the sleeve. It's a single loose thread, not noticed by most, but you saw it each day at prayer. It swayed with every movement. Caught light at odd angles, you wondered. Had it always been there? Would he ever pull it? Would it unravel everything? He never did, and the thread stayed like an unfinished verse. The missing HOURGLS had timed your readings, your copying, or silence. But one day the hourglass was gone, not stolen, not moved, just gone. You measured time by candle. Instead, it burned unevenly. That week felt longer, softer, less exact. And when the hourglass returned days later, without explanation, you almost missed the uncertainty. The monk who fed the CROWs, he wasn't supposed to. But each morning after matins, he scattered crumbs near the orchard. Crows came, black, glossy, clever, dash-eyed. He bowed to them. They squawked in reply. No one stopped him. Some habits, or prayers to the blank page at the end of a. Bioko turned the last leaf. The script ended, but there it was. A blank page. No words, no lines. Just space. It felt like breath. Like silence with shape. You stared longer at that empty page than any chapter, and sometimes you imagined the words it still might hold. The night the door was left UNLO. Suka des. Someone. Forgot the gate always barred, always bolted, left unlatched. The wind pushed it open gently. No one entered. No harm came. But that night, sleep came slowly. You felt the weight of walls, of routines, of the thin space between safety, chance. The next night, it was locked again, and silence returned. The candle that wouldn't LHHT flickered, sputtered, died again and again. You struck flint, whispered prayers, tried with steady hands. Still nothing. You replaced the wick. Still nothing. You left it be, lit another. Watched its calm flame dance. Not all light comes when called. The hidden. Painting behind the tapestry, a tapestry fell during cleaning. Behind it on the wall, a faded painting, a saint. Barely visible, soft outlines, weather-worn pigments. No, one knew who painted it. Or when it stayed uncovered for 1 week, then the tapestry was rehung, the saint hidden again. But now, you bowed slightly when passing, just in case. The sound of a book closing in the LIBR, or why not slammed. Not snapped, just a soft thump, as vellum pages met wood. It echoed through the library like a sigh. The monk folded his hands, bowed his head. Sometimes the closing of a book said more than its pages. A conversation ended, a memory shelved. Silence resumed, and still the dust floated on. The basket left out in the RI, and it sat near the well. Woven, sturdy, forgotten. By nightfall, rain fell, soft at first. Then steady, the basket filled, sagged, sank slightly. By morning it was emptied, dried, returned. But the damp scent lingered for days, sweet, earthy, familiar, even small things. Remember the weather? The smallest window in the whole of Monasteries white was hidden behind a staircase, no larger than your hand, set in stone, round, uneven. Through it, you saw only sky, a patch of blue or gray. No trees. Sky. Sometimes you sat near it, not to look out, but to remember how small seeing can be. The brother who sang to Eload, why ye, meant well, but his chant rose above the others. Clear, strong, almost proud. The abbot said nothing, nor did the choir, but the harmony shifted, around him. One day, without being asked, he stepped back a row, sang more softly, and somehow it felt fuller than before. The threadbare robe that nitrogen met, one arepolis, eed the washing line. It always hung crooked, its hem frayed, elbows thin, ties barely knotted. But it was never replaced. The brother who wore it never complained, and when he died, it was folded gently. No one wore it after that, but it remained on the shelf. Like a story already told. The single bell toll at Maida Tit rang once. Just once, midnight. No feast day.
No fire.
No cause. You sat up in your cot. Others stirred, but no voice called out. No second bell followed. The chapel door stayed closed. By morning, no one mentioned it, but that note lingered. Long after it faded, the mark left by a wet beocate was dropped just once into a basin, pulled out quickly, dried near the fire, but it was never quite the same. The pages warped. The cover curled. It smelled faintly of ash and steam, still legible, still sacred. But now, touched by water, like us all, the shadow that looked like a cross at dusk as the sun hit the eastern wall. Shadow formed, not carved, not painted, but formed, from the edge of the lectern. In the curve of the window, a shape like a cross. You noticed it once, then again some evenings it didn't appear, but when it did, you bowed without thinking. The bird that nested in the bell tuarshi built her nest in spring, high in the bell tower, small, gray quick. The rope puller delayed ringing, waited until her chicks grew. The bells were quieter that month. When they tolled again, the nest was gone, but the quiet stayed in memory. The day nothing HAPP guest arrived, no page was finished, no injury, no mistake, no other shift, just nothing. The chant was normal, the bread not burnt, the bells precise, and yet, that evening, a deep peace filled the cloister, as though the world had paused. To breathe chi, candle that burned UNAVNL, white, was just one candle set on the third sill near the southern trend. Thin pale, slightly bowed, it burned. Strangely, one side melted fast, dripping slowly down the stone like honey. The other side remained tall, barely touched, and so the light it cast was uneven, leaning toward the wall. Flickering like hesitation, the monks noticed. It said nothing. It still gave light. That was enough. You sat near it once, alone in the late afternoon, watched its flame dance over your hands. Your sleeves, your open book, it made the words shimmer. Breathe. And when the wax finally collapsed in on itself, pooling into a quiet disk at the base, you didn't replace it immediately. You let the shadows gather for a while. Not all light needs to be restored right away. Some is meant to vanish gently, without apology. The monk who spoke to Estione's brother Lucian never caused trouble. He scrubbed the floors, polished the sconces, repaired the sandals left at the door. But when no one was watching, or when he thought no one was watching, he spoke to stones. Not in sermons, not in chant. Just simple things. You're smooth today, still cold, even in the sun.
Thank
You for holding me when I sat? He spoke to cornerstones in the cloister, the heavy block near the well, even the tiny ones embedded in the old wall by the south dormitory. Some said he'd been a mason once, or a sculptor, or just lonely. But the stones never cracked under his words, and when he passed, his sandals were buried near the cloister steps, beside the largest, flattest slab. It's still there, and sometimes the novices say, warmer than the others, the room where no one wa untied wasn't locked. There was no rule forbidding entry, just a narrow wooden door behind the scriptorium, with hinges that hadn't turned in years, no dust outside it, no notes, no name. You passed it often, felt the coolness of its shadow. Noticed the way light stopped at its frame. Brother Antoine once said it had been a guest room. Another said it was once a sick room long before the infirmary was built, but no one opened it. And yet, the floor in front of it was always clean, swept by invisible care. One morning, during a storm, the wind pushed the door just slightly ajar. You looked in it. Was empty, bare stone, a stool, a crack in the ceiling, but the air inside was still. Different, as though it remembered being used, as though someone had only just left the prayer, written on sheep esquilles. Some books are fine, illuminated, bound in dyed leather. It's decorated with gold, but this one was plain. A single prayer, written in rough ink on stiff, wrinkled sheepskin, the edges curled. The letters crooked, the lines uneven, but the words were steady. A plea for rest. A blessing on unseen hands, no signatures, just a faded cross at the top, and a dot of wax at the bottom. You found it in a drawer no one used anymore. It smelled of salt and ash, it whispered when touched, and when you placed it back, you bowed slightly. Not to the words, but to the hand that wrote them, slow, unsure, fateful. The bread that fell into the ferret was meant for the table, risen overnight, golden, perfectly shaped. You carried it carefully toward the hearth, and stumbled. Just slightly the loaf slipped, fell into the ash and embers. It didn't burn completely, but the shape was ruined. The crust split, the scent soured. You pulled it out with tongs, brushing the ash away. The kitchen brother said nothing. He cut it, set it aside, and during the meal he served it anyway in pieces. To those who asked for seconds, no one complained. That evening you baked again. This time, slower, and placed the loaf with 2 hands. No bread is born perfect, but every loaf, even burnt, can be shared. The cloak left in the cloister WALK8 was folded neatly. Set upon the stone bench beneath the oldest arch, a cloak, heavy wool. Lined with linen, dry despite the morning frost. No one claimed it, not that day, not the next. Some said it had belonged to the monk who passed last season, left behind by mistake. Others wondered if a traveler had sought brief shelter. Warmed by the cloister's stillness, it remained there for weeks. Gathered mist, gathered silence, and when it was finally taken, no one saw who took it, but the bench held a crease for days after, like a body that had rested there, or an absence that knew how to sit. The ink that smelled of iron and vianag mixed it carefully. Gall. Ink, dark, sharp, lasting iron salts, oak galls, water, vinegar. The scent was biting. It clung to your sleeves. Your fingers stained purple at the tips, but it flowed beautifully. Each stroke darkened the page. Each letter settled deep into the vellum. It's almost part of it. Some hated the smell, but to you, it smelled like permanence, like time bound to a surface. You wrote slowly, carefully, 1 verse per hour, and when the ink finally ran dry, you rinsed the bowl and closed your eyes. You could still smell the page. The nest above the refectory, WAI above the refectory, tucked between stone and thatch, a nest appeared. Swallows most thought. They came each spring. Left by summer, their song was short, crisp, repetitive, but somehow cheerful during meals. You'd hear them through the window slit, tiny wings fluttering just above roasted barley and broth. Some monks disliked. The mess below the sill, but others smiled at the sound, even among stone and silence. Life insisted on making noise, the tiles that held the sun's HEAT by mid-morning. The courtyard tiles warmed, thick, red. Worn smooth by sandals, you crossed barefoot. Robes lifted, savoring each step. The warmth rose through your feet, your ankles. Up your spine, it stayed in your soles for hours. You returned to it often. On cloudy days, the stone was cold. And somehow, that absence felt heavier than it should. But on clear days, it felt like the earth remembered you. The sound of sleeping brothers in the dormitory or why and all chant had ended, and the last candle was pinched. The dormitory filled with sound, not loud, not sharp, but steady. Breath, a cough, the rustle of a robe, a foot shifting beneath a blanket, dozens of men, each alone in thought. Now breathing together, you listened from your cot, found comfort in the sameness of exhale and inhale, the soft chorus of sleep. You didn't know their dreams, but you shared their silence. And under the old beams, among dry straw and low moonlight, you joined them, breath by breath. The scroll that never unrolled, COMPLITL white, sat on a high shelf, wrapped in soft linen, bound with a narrow strip of aged leather. A scroll. It's unlike the others, older, brittle. The ink faded where it peeked out beneath. The rapt brother Thomas found it during inventory. He unwrapped it gently, reverently, but stopped before fully unfurling it. The parchment crackled beneath his fingers. Each tug risked a tear. Each crease held the tension of centuries, so he left. It partially unrolled, half exposed. One end revealed a diagram, circles, lines, tiny Latin notes, perhaps a map. Perhaps something sacred. No one finished the task. It remained that way, half open, half dash-guarded, and in time became a kind of metaphor. Some knowledge is meant to stay partially hidden, and some truths speak more in their silence than in their exposure. The sunbeam that landed on the same step every amor and ing, just after prime, as the bells stopped echoing in the misted courtyard. A sunbeam would slip through the southern arch. It touched the second step of the cloister walk, always the same one. It didn't stay long, perhaps 10 minutes, but during those moments, it shone like gold. Monks passed it without comment. Some paused. Some lingered. You once stood in it barefoot. It warmed the ball of your foot, climbed your calf, softened the world. On cloudy days, the step remained ordinary, just worn stone. Dark with dew, but when that light returned the next day, it was like a promise kept by the sun, by time, by something older than both. The mouse that visited the librr, white, entered through the crack beneath the window. Small, gray, silent. A mouse. At first it caused concern. Fear of chewed pages, nibbled bindings, but it never touched the books. It came only in the quietest hours. Late afternoon, when the scribes rested their wrists, it sniffed along the baseboards, gathered a crumb, and vanished. Brother Henry left a few seeds near the sill. Just in case, he said. The abbot saw once, said nothing. Sometimes, small lives keep their own vows, and in a library full of saints and kings, the mouse had its place too. The cloister tree that bent in the wind stood in the center of the courtyard, a pear tree, older than many of the monks. Its trunk split low, forming a way shape. Its bark was pale, flaking like old parchment in summer. Its leaves buzzed with bees. In winter, it bowed under frost, but in the wind, that autumn wind, that slipped down the mountains and stirred the cloister gardens, it bent, low, graceful, not snapping, not creaking, just yielding. You once sat beside it during a storm, watched its branches sway, its roots hold. It taught you a kind of strength, the kind that doesn't resist, the kind that bows and rises again. The drawing hidden on the back of a manuscript PAGE wasn't meant to be seen. A simple sketch, drawn lightly in ink, on the reverse side of a sermon text, a face long-nosed, sleepy-eyed, smiling faintly, possibly a monk. Possibly. No one at all. Beneath it, a note in Latin, reading only. He always forgets the second verse. You found it while repairing the spine, smiled gently. The work of some long-past scribe bored, perhaps or playful. He had labored over holy words, and left this small joy in the margins. Even devotion allows for a smile. And sometimes, memory survives through laughter. The day the candles wouldn't stand UPRGHT, the wax was soft from the unseasonable heat. Evening service neared, and none of the candles would stay straight in their holders. They leaned, slid, wobbled. You tried chilling them, trimming the ends, pressing them into the bases. Still, they tipped. Eventually, Brother Aeld fetched a bowl of cold water. You dipped each base in turn, firming the wax just enough to stay. The chapel filled with flickering, steady light, and the moment passed. Later that night, the scent of warmed beeswax still clung to your fingers, and you realized even light requires patience. The patch of lichen on the cloister WAL lit started as a small green smudge. On the west wall, near the arch no one used, lichen soft, spreading, layered like felt. No one scraped it. No one named it. Over years it grew delicate shades of green, blue, sometimes pale gray, a patchwork of silence. Birds perched above it, rain darkened it, frost curled its edges, but it never died. It changed shape, slowly, patiently, sometimes. Growth is not movement. Sometimes. It's simply staying. Asterisk, the stone that was warm even after SU and SIT, you noticed it on a walk late. After Vespers, the sun had long gone. The air was cool, damp, but one stone. Just beside the herb garden was warm to the touch. You placed your palm on it, then your cheek. It held the heat from earlier, kept it tucked within, like memory. Resting beneath surface, you returned to it often. In later weeks, never spoke of it. Some things are warmer when left unnamed. The silence that followed. Broken cupid slipped from a hand. A cup-glazed terracotta cracked from use. It hit the floor. Of the refectory, a sharp sound in a room, usually filled with spoons and whispered prayer. It broke in 3 neat pieces. And then, silence, no gasps, no scolding. Just the sound of still breath, held in respect for interruption. The brother who dropped it knelt, gathered the pieces, set them on the side table. The next morning, the pieces had been glued roughly. Gently, no one mentioned it again, but for days. The silence felt deeper. The final page of the ROLAIT, the end of the rule, the text that governed your life. Your hours, your thoughts. There was a final page. No flourish, no illustration, just a few last lines. They ended with, and beyond. All remain constant in humility, and the quiet will keep you. The page was smudged. You had read it many times, but this reading felt slower. You closed the book, traced, with your fingers along the leather binding, and breathed. Not an ending. Not quite. Just the last word before silence. The brother who walked in perfect CIRCLS, he did it each dusk. After his duties were done, not around the cloister, not through the halls, but in a corner of the herb garden. A small patch of grass. About 3 paces across, he walked in a circle. Carefully, steadily, always clockwise. His hands folded, eyes lowered. 10 laps, and he'd pause, bow slightly, and walk away. No one ever asked why, but once, when a novice mimicked him in jest, the abbot said quietly, "Leave him be." Some prayers are said with the feet. And so, the circles continued, even in light rain, even on frosty evenings, until one day it stopped. But if you look closely, even now, the grass is still thinner in that spot. The spoon that had nitrogen monoxide matching BOWL, it lived in the 3rd drawer of the scullery, heavy, dented, its handle worn. Smoothed by countless fingers. Unlike the others, its bowl was deep and oval, and its curve didn't match the monastery's bowls. It made a strange sound. Against clay, more of a thunk than a clink. You tried it once? Then again, something about it felt honest. Anchored, one brother said it came from the village. Another said it had been gifted by a traveler. No one knew for sure, but it remained washed. It's returned to its drawer, passed from hand to hand. Some tools outlive their stories and carry their silence well. The night sky behind the cloister RCHES after Compline. When candles dimmed and the cloister emptied, you stepped into the walk and looked up, through the arches. Framed perfectly lay the night sky, vast, cold, quiet, a smear of stars, the faint shape of the hunter, a low-hanging moon. The arches made it feel closer, like the sky was being held. A roofless room. You didn't pray or speak. You just looked. The stars were slow, silent, as they had been when the first stone of the monastery was laid, as they would be when the last word here was written. Some truths arrive in darkness, and they don't speak. They shine. The incastained fingerprint on the margin. The manuscript was beautiful, precise, balanced, rich with small illuminations. But near the bottom of the 47th page, single fingerprint, dark, smudged, ink pressed into parchment by accident. It marred the script. The brothers had debated copying the page anew, but the abbot said no. It reminds us, he whispered, that hands made this, not angels. Years passed, the manuscript aged, but the print remained soft around the edges, but still visible. Quiet echo of one who labored and lingered. The stone that fell from the CEI Liongid was only a chip no larger than your thumb. It fell during matins, landing near the font with a quiet tick. Not loud, it's not dangerous, but noticed. The monks paused. Briefly, the chant faltered, then resumed. After service, you knelt to pick it up. Rounded edges. Warm from the sun earlier, it had likely worked loose over decades. It was set on a shelf near the door, not discarded, not hidden, just placed. Even holy places crumble slowly, kindly. Even the strongest roofs sometimes offer pieces of themselves. Back to the floor, the day the well reflected the sky, PRFCTLY. The well was usually rippled, stirred by the wind, marked by falling leaves. But on this morning, it was still so still, it became mirror. The sky lay inside it, pale blue, scattered cloud, a bird circling, all held in that round frame of stone. You approached slowly, careful not to break the surface with your breath. For a moment, the monastery seemed to hover above itself, two skies, two worlds. One silent then, a drop fell perhaps, from a passing leaf, and the sky scattered, just as gently as it had gathered, the shoe soles worn into an ovieltha. Sandals were kept for years, leather straps, thick soles. At first glance, ordinary, but when turned over, worn into the shape of an oval, not symmetrical, not neat. From walking the same paths, prayers at the same altar, buckets from the same well, the soul carried. Memory, you traced it with your thumb. No one wore them now, but they remained in the corner cupboard, because sometimes footsteps deserve a resting place too. The candle that refused to die, it burned long. Past its time, lit during vigils, it flickered but did not fade. Hour by hour, as others guttered and failed, this one held its flame, even when the wax puddled. Even as the wick shortened to a thread, it burned into silence and still gave light. When it finally gave out, long after morning bells, the brothers stood near it for a moment, no words, just the soft scent of wax, some light. Lingers longer than it should. And when it goes, it teaches us how much it gave. Scent of lavender at the DORWAY wasn't planted nearby. And yet, the western threshold, there was always a hint of lavender, faint, clean, comforting, especially at twilight. No. One confessed to scattering petals, or burning oil, but the scent was there. It greeted you like an old friend, a quiet welcome, a permission to pause, and as your hand passed the cold stone of the doorframe, you breathed it in and felt something ease. The moment when even the birds were salient. It happened rarely, perhaps once each season. A moment when the wind dropped. The chant ended. The bells slept. The pages stopped turning. Even the birds, chatterers of eaves and arches, held their songs. The world paused. No sound, no step. No stir of air, not absence, not emptiness. Just a breath held by the world. Itself, you noticed it, and in that heartbeat of stillness, you felt closer to something ancient. Not spoken, it's not written. Just known, just known. The prayer left unfinished on the WALIT was written in charcoal, faint lines on rough stone. A prayer, half-dash finished. Just a few words in Latin, Domini da mihi. Lord, grant me. And then, no ending, no object, no plea, just those first few words. Perhaps the monk was called away. Perhaps the charcoal crumbled. Perhaps he didn't know what to ask for. No one washed it off. Over time it faded, but it never vanished completely. Even now, when the light strikes just right, you can make it out the soft curve of the D, the tremble of the M. Some prayers are meant to be left open, and some are answered in silence. The day the fire refused to see. Asha, the morning was cold, damp. The wood gathered and dried days before should have burned, but it wouldn't. You tried pine kindling, then straw, then prayer. Smoke rose, thick and white, but no flame. The room remained chilled, breath fogged in the chapel. You worked with flint until your hands ached, then stopped. Let the hearth sit black and sullen. The brothers ate cold porridge that day. No one complained. By evening, the wood caught without effort, but the lesson had already arrived. Some things begin only when you stop forcing them. The bell. That rang at the wrong time. It was soft, uncertain. A single bell during sext, when no bell should have rung. No storm, no visitor, no signal. The monks paused in the psalm, eyes lifted but no voice called out. Later they checked the ropes, the towers, the ledgers. No one claimed it, and yet the sound had been clear. The abbot said nothing, only added a single line to the margin of that day's record. Perhaps some bells are not rung by hands. The page was turned. The chant resumed, but the echo stayed a while longer. The brother who slept with his hands CLASPD, he was not a speaker, not a singer, not a leader, but he was gentle. And each night before the last bell faded, he would lie on his side, hands clasped beneath his chin, like a child in prayer, or a saint in stone. Even in sleep, his brow stayed calm. One winter, when illness swept the dormitory, he passed quietly, in the same posture. They buried him with his hands clasped, as though he had only just closed his eyes. The thread that tied the Eliantirant was just thread, wound tightly around the base of the iron lantern, securing it to the wooden beam above the door. No one remembered tying it, but it held. Through wind, through rain, through the years, the lantern swayed, but never fell. You replaced the oil once and saw the thread frayed. But faithful, you almost replaced it, then paused and left it. Not all strength is new. Some of it is quiet persistence. Cold, that came from the FLOR, rose slowly from beneath the flagstones. Up through your sandals, into your bones, cold. The kind that made breath tight, muscles slow. The fire helped little. The robes layered and thick only muted it, and yet didn't hurt. It reminded of stillness, of humility, of the body's limits. You walked slower, sat more carefully. Even the ink dried slower in the shrimp, and when spring finally came, so the warmth felt earned. Cold teaches patience. The sound of rain on the laundry RP. The robes had just been hung, long linen shapes, swaying gently above. The gravel walk then, rain not, harsh, not hurried. A steady percussion, drops, hitting the ropes, tapping the fabric. Pooling in the folds you watched from the arch. Each drop darkened the cloth. The scent of wet fiber filled the air. no one moved to take them down. Some days the robes were washed twice, not by hands, but by sky. The name scratched into the stone beneath the WINDOWIND was small, nearly invisible unless you stooped and looked sideways. A name scratched into the sill beneath the north window, not with care, not in script, just lines, crooked and shallow. Perhaps a novice, long ago, or a traveler, or someone lost to the records. But the name remained, softened by wind, smoothed by rain, not quite readable, not quite erased, just waiting. The bread that never aroused. It was cold that morning. The dough was heavy, tired, and when it was baked, it remained flat, dense, pale, unyielding. You nearly threw it out, but Brother Armand sliced it carefully, served it anyway. The brothers chewed slowly, no jokes, no complaints. Later, he leaned toward you and whispered, "Some days the bread teaches us to chew." The room that smelled of wax and CLOVS, it was rarely used, a side room off the hallway to the chapter house, but once opened, the air within was warm, not warm from fire but from scent, old beeswax, a faint note of clove, dust that smelled of paper. You entered slowly, sat in the wooden chair, touched nothing, and for a moment it felt like time had paused. The room had no name, but it knew how to wait. The wax that never fully HRD and dyed the candle had been poured late in the day. The wax, thick with resin, cooled unevenly in the mold by dawn, still held a softness, not liquid, not solid. You could press your thumb into it, leave a gentle mark, and watch it slowly forget. "Brother," Elias said, not to worry. "Some wax never fully hardens, and that's not always a fault." They lit it anyway. It burned just fine. A little slower, or a little gentler, and when it dripped, the drops held shape longer before falling. Not all things need to finish forming. Some remain in between. The window that whistled in the WIND, the frame was sound, the lead firm. But whenever wind passed from the north, the window whistled, a thin, high sound, not sharp, but steady, like breath through a reed. At first it was distracting, but over time it became a kind of voice, not speaking, not calling, just existing, singing, perhaps, in its own way. And when the wind changed and the whistle ceased, you found yourself waiting for it again, because even stone learns to sing. The robe patched at the SHOULDRIT had been worn for years. The brown robe with the faded hem, but the patch at the shoulder stood out most, a slightly different weave, a deeper shade, stitched with care, but not hidden. The monk who wore it never adjusted it, never explained, and when he passed, the robe was folded, placed near the novice's cot. The novice wore it proudly. The patch told a story of wear, of mending, of continuing anyway. The cup that caught the first RA in it had been left outside by mistake, on the step by the cloister walk. A cup, turned just enough to face the sky, and so, when the first autumn rain arrived, it filled. No hands touched it, but the water inside shimmered like silver. You found it at dawn, lifted it carefully, drank the taste, clean, faintly metallic, impossibly cold, a sip from the sky itself. No blessing was spoken, but none was needed. The bell that echoed TWIC. Rope was pulled. The bell rang once. Then again, not from the hand, but from the echo. It bounced from the hills, turned softer, like a second thought, memory repeating itself. The monks paused, slightly smiling. Two sounds, one effort. Some calls. Return to you when you least expect them. The moment before the first WRDU stood in the chapel, book in hand. The room was quiet, the light low. Your voice would begin the chant, just one line, and then the others would follow. But for a moment, before the breath, before the sound, there was stillness, thick, complete. And in that pause was everything. The silence before sound, the thought before speech, The hush before the world begins again. The shadow of the cross on the stone fell, a rich sunset. As the sun slipped low and sideways, the great crucifix cast a shadow. It stretched across the refectory floor, warped slightly, blurred at the edges. It moved slowly, hour by hour, until it touched the foot of the opposite wall and disappeared. Some never noticed it. Others sat quietly to watch. A shape of belief, not carved, but cast, not fixed, but fleeting, and perhaps more powerful because of it. The air just before SNOW8 wasn't cold enough yet, but the air changed. Could feel it in your throat, see it in the light, taste it faintly in the wind. No snow had fallen, but everyone moved differently. Softer steps, slower breaths, robes wrapped tighter. The monastery too seemed to pause, a breath in the chest. Of winter waiting to be exhaled, the room that held old LAUGHTR it was once a guest room, then a storage room, now unused. But when you entered, the air felt different, as though it had once held laughter long ago. Often you couldn't hear it, not really, but you sensed it in the corners. In the way the light curved on the wall, in the looseness of the floorboards. Not everything leaves a visible mark. Some joy lingers quietly in the wood. The final page turned with secure. The book was old, binding soft. Pages thick with ink and time. You had read it slowly over weeks, savoring each page now. The final chapter done. Your fingers hovered over the last sheet, and then you turned it. Not quickly, but with the gentleness one gives to endings. The blank page felt like breath, like stillness, like rest. You closed the book, placed it back on the shelf, and sat with the silence it left behind. The dust that settled after the last page after the book had been closed and returned to its place. The air around you seemed to shift, not suddenly, not loudly, but with a subtle hush that only comes when something meaningful concludes. A thin veil of dust rose as the book met the shelf, then floated lazily down again, catching in the golden slant of late sunlight that filtered through the old glass. No one else saw it, not really, but you stood a moment longer, watching that soft descent as though the pages had exhaled, and in the stillness that followed, there was no need to speak, for even the particles in the air carried memory. The bench that creaked in RACOG Oneida had been many months since you sat in that particular place, the second bench from the eastern transept. The one nearest the tall pillar that bore the faded carving of a lion and a lamb. When you lowered yourself gently onto it, the wood creaked not sharply, not in protest, but more like a sigh of recognition. As if it remembered your weight, your posture, your silences, the grain of the wood pressed against your robe, polished smooth, not by varnish, but by centuries of sitting and rising. Always in rhythm with the bell, and for a while, you sat without motion, listening to the quiet groan of ancient joinery, and felt, quite clearly, that you were not alone. The scent of ashes in the afternoon air, the morning fire, had long burned out, and yet the faint scent of ashes lingered in the afternoon air, curling like a ghost around the edges of the cloister garden, threading itself into the folds of your sleeve. It was not unpleasant, not the acrid sting of smoke, but the soft, dry scent of something completed, something transformed by flame into rest. You breathed it in and thought of palms from last spring, of old sermons and older habits, of the way ritual sometimes smells like surrender, and though no fire burned before you now, its warmth remained in the air, like a quiet hand pressed between your shoulder blades. The vine that grew through the wall near the edge of the refectory, tucked behind a low arch that rarely saw visitors, a vine had crept through the ancient stone, just a single tendril at first, green and tentative, pushing between the mortar like a breath pressed through lips. No one had the heart to cut it back. It wasn't invasive, merely present, an intrusion so slow, so polite, that it felt more like a guest than a trespasser. Over the seasons, its leaves spread lightly along the base of the wall, curling toward the morning light, catching dew. casting tiny shadows that danced faintly across the floor. And somehow, in its quiet insistence, it had become a part of the place, not a challenge to the monastery's stillness, but a reminder that even stone must make room for the living. The book left open for just a moment, Lo-ng or Brother Anselm had finished copying his passage hours ago. The page was dry, the quill cleaned, the candle snuffed, and yet the book remained open, its delicate spine cradled by 2 blocks of wood, the page gently breathing in the air of the Scriptorium. It wasn't forgetfulness, it was reluctance, a hesitance to close something that had so willingly opened itself. You passed the desk later, and saw it still there, illuminated only by the fading light of dusk, a psalm. Midline hanging like a sentence not quite spoken. Some texts do not end with punctuation, but with silence. And in that silence, the room became a chapel all its own. The garden that had already forgiven Wintr beneath the pale, cracked soil of the monastery garden, something had already begun, not loudly, not visibly, but with the soft certainty that comes from cycles. Older than words, tiny shoots of green broke the earth's surface, curling upward as though bowing their heads before they rose. Winter was not yet done. Frost still lingered on the stone, but the garden had already forgiven it. No anger, no blame, just patience. In return, you stooped to touch one shoot, delicate as a thread, brave as a bell, and it did not flinch. The thread that tied the beads. Pogtr, the rosary that Brother Laurent used, was not ornate. Its beads were carved from olive wood, small, imperfect, their edges worn smooth from decades of touch. But what mattered most was what could not be seen, the thin cord running through. Each bead, tying the whole together, you replaced it once. When the old thread began to fray, wove the new cord through each one slowly, carefully whispering a verse at each turn, not because it was required, but because it felt right. And when you gave it back, Brother Laurent simply nodded. Sometimes the most sacred parts are the ones that never show. The rain that fell, without a sow and dew, didn't hear it at first, not because it was distant, but because it was soft. A rain so fine it didn't strike. The stone but kissed it, absorbed before it could echo. It fell like a sigh, like breath beneath breath. The courtyard darkened, leaves took on deeper color. Puddles formed without, ripples. Even the birds quieted. You stood beneath the overhang and let the stillness wrap around you, not as silence, but as a kind of lullaby made from water and air. Some storms shout, but this one whispered you toward peace. The spider who built beside the bloy, between the heavy frame of the bell tower and the worn rope that called the hours, a spider had spun a web fine, laced with dew, catching the early morning light in threads of liquid silver. No one noticed it for days. It danced gently whenever the bell was rung, not torn, not destroyed, just shifted, then settling again into place. You watched it once, the spider reworking. A corner, unfazed by the thunder of bronze above. There was no fear in its work, only rhythm, as if it, too, knew the hours. The word that didn't need to be spoken at the evening meal. A novice spilled water, not loudly, not disastrously, just a soft slosh onto the worn table. He looked up, expectant, perhaps bracing for correction, but no one said a word. Brother Hugo reached gently for a cloth, wiped the table clean, and resumed his spoonful of lentils. No nod, no smile, no forgiveness spoken, but it was given, because in this place, some understandings are not exchanged in language, they are passed. In gesture, the gate that never closed, all the way, the outer gate, tall and wooden, reinforced by iron bands and wrapped in ivy, had long ago lost the strength of its full closure. Its latch stuck, just slightly leaving a finger's width of space between door and frame. It wasn't wide enough to see through, or even feel the breeze. But it meant that the gate never quite said no. There was always a sliver of permission, a whisper of welcome, a space through which light could pass. The abbot once said, "Let it be." Even the most sacred walls must leave room for grace to slip in. And so it stood, neither open nor closed, but quietly available. The onion that sprouted in the clorit had rolled behind the baskets. A humble onion, its paper skin curling and flaking in the shadows of the cellar. But when the baskets were moved, you found it not spoiled, not sunken, but sprouting. 2 bright green shoots had emerged, long and coiled. Stretching into the dim air as though reaching for a world they could not see, you held it gently, marveled at its quiet defiance. Here, where no sun had shone for weeks, it had still decided to begin again. You placed it in a bowl near the window. It did not ask for more, but when it received it, it grew. The sound of a quill pausing mid-sentence in the scriptorium. Silence reigned, not absence of sound, but the presence of intention, the scratch of quills, the turn of pages, the soft exhale of concentration. But most telling of all was the pause, that single moment when a brother stopped writing, mid-word or mid-line, and the quill hovered, not because of error, not because of distraction, but because he was thinking. You could feel it in the air, the weight of thought, the delicacy of care. Writing here, not transcription. It was prayer with ink, and the pause was part of the sentence. The beggar, who left without SPA, came at midday, wrapped in gray, leaning heavily on a staff carved from a gnarled branch. He did not speak. He did not ask. But he stood at the edge of the garden wall, not quite looking up, not quite looking in. Brother. Lucien saw him first. Walked slowly to the gate, offered a crust of bread, a bit of soft cheese, a pouch of herbs for the journey. The man accepted with a nod, and without a word. He turned and departed. Some acts of kindness do not require voices, they are understood, remembered, returned, in time, in ways we may never see. The moss between the SDO and S, if you look down while crossing the cloister walk, you'd see it, the moss, delicate, emerald green, growing between the old stones, threading its way. Through centuries of faux-os, it never bloomed, never called attention to itself, but it softened the ground, and in that softness, it kept time slowly, steadily reclaiming what had once been laid in rigidity. You crouched once, touched it lightly. It felt like memory, cool, quiet, unhurried, a kind of living patience. The laundry that took its time, Dakara Yng, the linen robes were washed at sunrise, wrung out by hand, and hung on the line strung between 2 cypress trees. But the sun was shy that day, hiding behind clouds, casting a pale silver over everything. The robes swayed, but they didn't dry quickly. You checked them at midday, and again at vespers. Still damp, still cold, but they would dry. Eventually the wind and time would see to it, and no one hurried them. For, in this place, even laundry was allowed its full rhythm. The feather that landed on the LTAR floated in during terse light as breath, white with a single gray band near its tip. A feather, drifting through the high window as the chant rose. It moved as though guided, curving, turning, and finally came to rest on the edge of the altar, where the light struck it like a pearl. No one reached for it. No. One moved to remove it. The brothers finished their song, and the feather remained a brief visitor, silent and soft, as though blessing the space with its impermanence. The letter, written but never seen, teeing the scriptorium drawer. Beneath folded scraps of vellum and an unused seal was a letter. The ink was dry, the script steady, the wax unbroken. It was addressed, but never delivered. Perhaps the words were meant for someone gone. Perhaps they were never meant to be read at all. But the letter remained, kept not for its content, but for its intention. It held something. Quiet, something true, a thought too tender for journey, but too meaningful to destroy. The ringing in your ears after the BLS when the bells rang high above. Deep and round, the sound filled every corner. It struck the walls. It moved. The dust, it vibrated in your chest, and then it ended. But something remained, a faint humming. A sensation more than a sound, It sat in your ears, behind your eyes, in the center of your ribs. Not unpleasant, not loud, just presence lingering. Even after the bell had stopped, its message was still being heard, the light that moved across. The FLO are throughout the day, the light shifted, not in leaps, but in a slow, deliberate dance across the stone floor of the chapel. It began narrow and golden, near the threshold. Then it lengthened, deepened, fanned out across the altar steps. By none, it reached the far wall. By vespers, it had vanished entirely. You watched it once, hour by hour, as if attending a sermon given not in words, but in light and in its patient journey. You learned something wordless. That presence does not always require motion. Sometimes it is enough simply to be there, changing slowly. The pillow stuffed with HRBS, the pillow was not grand, not even soft by modern thought. A simple linen sack, hand-stitched, slightly flattened with age and use, but within, beneath layers of cotton and coarse wool, it had been stuffed with herbs, lavender, thyme, and a hint of dried mint gathered during midsummer, cured in the sun, then crumbled gently by hand. Each night, when your head settled upon it, there was no sudden scent, no overwhelming bloom, but a faint hush of fragrance. Just enough to soften the breath and slow the thoughts. It did not sing you to sleep, but it led you there steadily. Like a trusted guide through the dim forest of mind, the nail that held nothing at Alalit protruded just slightly from the refectory wall. A single iron nail, rusted at its head, too short to hang anything of weight, too old to have purpose. Now, and yet no one pulled it out. Perhaps once it held a lamp, or a wooden plaque, or a monk's list of names. Now it held only air. And the story that absence tells, when the light caught it in the afternoon, it cast a small shadow almost. Invisible and still, it remained part of the place. Even things that hold nothing still have a place in the wall. The water jar that didn't be alone among the neat rows of earthenware and hand-thrown jugs. There was one jar that stood out. Its glaze was different, smoother, paler, almost bluish in the right light, and the lip of it flared in a shape not common to the region. No one recalled who brought it. No inventory listed it. No monk claimed it, yet it had been there for years. Always filled with water, always clean. It felt older. Not older in age, perhaps, but in presence, like something borrowed from another monastery or another century, still fulfilling its quiet purpose, even as it remained unnamed. The loaf that cooled beside the window, the kitchen, was silent after Compline. The oven still faintly warm, and there, on the wooden sill beside the half-open window, rested a single loaf of bread. Cooling in the evening air, its crust was dark, golden brown and gently cracked, the scent of baked grain mixing with the scent of pine from the trees beyond the garden. It wasn't large or perfectly shaped, but as the breeze moved through the screen and brushed over the surface, it seemed content. Bread, in this place, was not merely sustenance. It was a prayer given form in this loaf. Resting alone in twilight was its quiet amentied slip of paper, tucked into the crack in the stonez, just beside the main stairwell. Where the oldest stones curved toward the cloister walk, a slip of paper had been pressed gently into a narrow crack, small, folded, anonymous. It had yellowed at the edges, the ink barely visible through the creases. No one disturbed it. It had been there for weeks, maybe years, too fragile to touch, too private to open. Its presence was enough. A secret folded between stone and air. A whisper left for no ear to hear. A hope not shouted but left. To rest, some prayers are not meant for altars. Some are meant only for walls. The fingerprint on the window GLSS, the window in the corridor, caught the morning sun, casting long rectangles of golden light onto the stone floor below and on the glass itself. Near the edge, nearly invisible, unless the light struck just right, there was a fingerprint. Just one, not fresh. Not oily, but enough to catch the dust. Enough to say, someone had stood here, looked out, perhaps in thought. perhaps in longing, the world offers few ways to remain. But in that soft, perfect mark, there was presence not past, not gone, but quietly lingering. The shoes left beside the dew, or they were worn, the soles thinned from walking, the leather softened, cracked around the edges, shaped to a specific foot, placed with care beside the door, not inside it, not hidden, no lock, no worry. Shoes like that had walked the garden paths, the kitchen tiles, the midnight hallway to the chapel. They rested there as though they, too, knew their place and knew they would be found again, to leave something unguarded as a form of faith. The window that showed only SK wine like the others. This window did not overlook the courtyard or the path or the distant orchard. It looked up, set higher in the southern wall. Its view held no trees, no roofs, no bells, only sky blue. On clear days,
gray.
On others, star-filled in the hours before Matus, and when clouds moved, you could watch them, slowly folding and unfolding like parchment held to the wind. It was a window without distraction, a way to see only what changed, yet never ceased. The stone that held the Suanir, the apse, beneath the bench closest to the southern side. One stone stayed warm long after the sun had moved on, not hot, not bright, but warm in a way that you noticed only when your hand brushed it in passing, or your robes brushed against it as you sat. You wondered how many years it had done this, how often light had struck that same angle, stoked and held. Tight, not all stones are cold. Some remember heat, and give it back slowly. The door that gave way without a Suan dit was old, the small. A rounded door that led to the sacristy, warped slightly in the frame, its hinges blackened with age. But when you pushed it, expecting a groan or a creak, without resistance, without sound, without question, the air beyond was cool, scented, faintly of linen and old wood. You stepped through. Sometimes, the most sacred thresholds are the ones that do not announce themselves. They simply give way and let you pass. The ladle worn thin by Servianja hung by the hearth on a rusted nail. The ladle seemed unremarkable at first glance, carved from wood, the bowl shallow. The handle darkened where countless hands had held it, but when you looked closer you saw that its edge had been worn. Not cracked, not broken, but thinned by use. Its curve shaped by years of dipping into broth, soup, and porridge. This was not a tool that had been left behind. It had been used into softness. It's the kind of word that speaks not of damage, but of faithful repetition. No one spoke of it, but every bowl it filled was a small, quiet blessing. The leaf pressed between the pags, tucked in the binding of a worn Latin psalter. Just between two psalms of mercy was a single leaf, flat, brittle, barely colored anymore, its veins delicate as lace, its shape held in perfect stillness. No one had written beside it, or noted its presence. It was there without explanation, like a thought caught mid-prayer. Perhaps it had fallen in. Perhaps it had been placed with purpose. But there it lay, resting in sacred words. It's preserved not for what it said, but for the silence it shared, the thread unwinding from a COW of Brother Thomas. His cowl had always hung a little longer on one side, not enough to notice unless you looked closely, until a single thread began to unravel from the hem. Just one. It didn't cause a tear. It didn't fray wildly, it simply unwound slowly, as if the garment itself were releasing a story it had long held. And still, he wore it, never bothered, never rushed to mend it. To him it was still warm, still fit, still part of the life he moved through. One thread now moving too. The window latch left open on Purpo, the brother who tended the third-floor dormitory. Always left the window latch loose, not because he forgot, not because it was broken, but because he liked the air to move. Even on cold nights, he said it was better for sleep, the way the wind moved just slightly across the stone floor, how it hummed faintly through the frame. It keeps the room awake, he said once, just enough to know it's still part of the world, and those who slept beneath it never complained. There was comfort in a room that breathed. The bowl that never left the WINDOWSI lounge, there the infirmary. On a windowsill where the light was clearest in the afternoon sat a bowl. Small, unglazed, chipped. At the rim, always there. Sometimes it held water. Other times sage or lavender or dry pine cones collected from the path. But often it held nothing. Just itself. Present, no one moved it. No one asked why it stayed. It had become part of the window, as much as the stone or the light or the air, and in its presence, simple. Undemanding was a kind of daily kindness. The word mispronounced in Collard or in Lauds, the novice faltered. On a word, just one syllable, misplaced, softened where it should have been firm. The chant did not stop. No one frowned. No one corrected. The harmony shifted for half a beat, then returned gentle and full. And afterward, as they walked to the cloister, someone placed a hand lightly on the novice's shoulder. No need to speak, for here, the mistake was not disruption, but proof that we were singing together. The shadow that returned each EVI, any injury dusk, just as the bell for Vespers began its first toll. A shadow would appear across the chapter house floor, long and bent at first, then upright and square. As the sun dropped lower, it wasn't cast by a person. It came from the outer wall, where a vine-laced trellis filtered the light just so, and it moved exactly the same way. Every evening, some brothers came early just to watch it. It was a kind of clock, but gentler, a quiet rhythm marking the hour. Not with chimes, but with shape and light, the pot warmed by hands Alanitha. Novice had forgotten to stoke the kitchen fire before dawn. The tea water cooled too quickly. The broth wouldn't heat, and so the older brother wordlessly took the pot in his hands and held it near his chest, wrapping his sleeves around it like a child. He hummed quietly, waited. After a time, the pot began to feel warm again. Not enough to cook, but enough to share. The novice, embarrassed, apologized. But the older monk simply nodded. There are many ways to make heat, said. The crack in the floor that grew year by Waia at the corner of the chapel were few. Feet walked, and only the morning light ever lingered long. A crack had formed in the flagstone floor, thin at first like a hairline. A scratch, but over the years it widened, not in haste, not in warning. Just a slow, silent drift between two slabs of stone. No one marked it. No one repaired it. It became part of the floor, a wrinkle perhaps, in the monastery's face, not damage. Just a reminder that even silence can shift. The name carved too lightly to LASTM the edge of the northern cloister. Behind a tangle of ivy was a stone where someone long ago had carved a name, not deeply, just enough to be read in the right light. When your eyes squinted and your breath slowed, now only a few letters remained. Time had blurred them. Rain had thinned them. But you could still sense the act, the way the hand had moved. The care in the chisel, the hope in the gesture. Some names are meant to stay, others to fade softly into stone. The candle that never burned DOW. Near the altar, kept in a carved wooden box lined with linen, there was a single candle, thick white UNLIT. It was set aside, marked with wax in scripture, meant for a night of need, a vigil, or a moment so sacred that no other flame would do. But it was never used, not in fire, not in shadow, and still. It remained even unlit. It carried a kind of radiance. For some light is not in burning, but in readiness, the sound of a door gently being shuta. Monk returning late moved through the corridor with care, steps quiet, breath steady. When he reached the door he paused, then closed it. Not with force, not hurriedly, just enough. Pressure to click it into place. The sound was barely there, a soft joining of wood to frame. And yet it carried meaning, for every opening must one day be answered with closure, even the quietest ones, the echo that never a wreath or a neath there was. One alcove in the rear chapel where, if you whispered, the walls did not return your voice, not muffled, not blurred, just nothing. No echo, no repeat. No feedback from stone or ceiling. Words entered and disappeared. It was unsettling at first, but over time became a place of special silence, a space where even speech surrendered itself. What? You said there did not need to come back. It only needed to go. Asterisk. The last sleep before WINTR, the last leaf had fallen in the garden. The wind no longer played. Only moved steady, cool, certain. That night, before the season truly turned. The monks lay in their beds, not restless, not watchful, only still. The final sleep before winter was not heavy. It's not filled with dreams. Just the kind of rest that follows slow labor and steady prayer and warm bread. Sleep like stone, like folded robes, like frost finding the window. The place where nothing more needed to shape a piano. The end of the hallway, past the last bench, beneath a window that had long since forgotten how to open, there was a small niche in the wall. It held nothing. No book, no statue, no candle, just space. But it wasn't empty. It was complete. The kind of space that held everything it ever needed, simply by being there, unasked, unoffered. It's utterly present. And when you stood before it quietly, unthinking, it felt like the monastery itself was breathing with you, not asking, not answering, just being. And now, as the candle flickers lower, as the stone cools, as the chant fades into breath, you lie quietly in the same world once held by cloister walls. The monastery does not ask questions. It does not hurry. It does not chase. It offers time, space, slowness. It reminds you that silence holds meaning, that repetition builds peace. Presence is enough. So sleep now. Let your breath find its rhythm. Let your body soften. Let your thoughts become stone, rain, parchment, light. The world behind these walls continues, steady, still, sacred, and you are part of it. Good night. Good night.